From the United Nations headquarters in New York, this is Disarmament Today.
My name is John Ennis. I'm a Senior Political Affairs Officer for the Office for Disarmament Affairs. And this is the first in a series of podcasts where there'll be interviews about disarmament issues with disarmament experts. Our first guest is Dr. Kathleen Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan's a PhD, disarmament educator and activist who's been engaged in nuclear issues for over 20 years. Currently, she's the program director for Hibakusha Stories, an arts-based initiative that brings atomic bomb survivors into New York City high schools to share their testimonies. She has been an education consultant for the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. And Dr. Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you, John.
What is disarmament and non-proliferation education, and why is it important for individuals to understand this subject?
Well, in 2002, the UN launched a study on disarmament and non-proliferation education that had 34 recommendations for its implementation. And the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan, had, in a sense, commissioned the report because he said that young people were really growing up with scant knowledge about the dangers that they face in our world as it pertains to small arms, but particularly to nuclear weapons. And so at his behest, Ambassador Miguel Marin Bosch of Mexico chaired a study on disarmament and non-proliferation education. I think the only real predecessor to that would have been a study in the 80s by UNESCO. So it was certainly high time to update because those of us of a certain age will remember that in the 1980s, nuclear disarmament was on many people's heart minds, but in the year 2000, it had sort of fallen off the, public radar, even though in a certain sense we live in a more dangerous nuclear world because there are more nuclear weapon states today than there were in the 1980s when there was a huge amount of activism. At any rate, in 2002, the UN released this study. The 34 recommendations were adopted by the member states of the United Nations during the General Assembly. And those recommendations are to support disarmament education not only at the level of students and citizenry, but also on the professional level. So, for instance, junior diplomats, incoming journalism, in other words, the professional sector as well as the public sector. And the idea is that we are creating education for disarmament. This is a really important distinction because one of the goals of the UN is for nuclear disarmament, and that's certainly the goal of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the only treaty that exists on the subject of nuclear disarmament. And so we are looking to develop education at all levels of society that will prepare people for the inevitability of disarmament. So it was a really, really important study, and we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of that study in 2012. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about disarmament education because it's something that really all people deserve to know and understand the dangers that face us in our world and what we can do to mitigate these.
It's interesting that you talk about the study that was done in 2002, and now we're coming up almost on the 10th anniversary. And you mentioned the 34 recommendations of the study. Can you just give us a summary of what I'm not asking you to tell us what all 34 recommendations are, but just a summary of the most salient ones.
Well, the one that I love to quote is that member states have agreed to support NGOs that are on the ground doing the disarmament education financially. Sadly, that seems to be a forgotten recommendation. But other recommendations are how to use new technologies to encourage this new generation of young people to engage in disarmament education. And updating the curriculum in schools to include disarmament and non-proliferation in the formal education of students. And like I said, there's also recommendations that talk about foreign ministries training young diplomats in disarmament education. And I think the key point that I want to emphasize is that we're not talking about the if, but the when of disarmament. So this is preparing member states, preparing members of civil society, preparing really the human race for the post-nuclear age, and when we abolish nuclear weapons, and also for how do we solve conflict without violence. And that's where the recommendations that pertain to small arms is really important, because unfortunately we've seen a rash of proliferation in gun violence throughout the world, and it's important to think about how we can control the spread of arms, but ultimately, how do we work to solve issues without violence?
So, if we could just go back a little bit. So, we're talking about education curricula that focuses on formal education, but also, I would imagine, also informal education opportunities. If you could just give us an example of the type of curricula that would be used in conveying information about disarmament education, that would be helpful so that people could understand.
Okay. Well, one of the realizations of these 34 recommendations is some work that's been done through the UN Cyber School Bus. And there is a curricula that has been developed and is posted online. And that is, if you go to the Cyber School Bus, un.org/cyber school bus, you can find our disarmament and non-proliferation education web portal on the UN Cyber School Bus site. And that really explains the study. It also explains the different methods for teaching. And really, one of the important recommendations was an interactive pedagogy. So we're not sitting in a classroom telling students, but we're providing experiences for students to understand why disarmament is important, and for them to, have some of their own discovery. One of the things that we highlight on the UN Cyber School Bus site for disarmament and non-proliferation education is something called Ask a Hibakusha. And this is, Hibakusha is the Japanese word for atomic bomb survivor. And students learn about what the Hibakusha experienced in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and are encouraged to ask questions. And we've had in the past, and hopefully we'll have more in the future, interactive webcasts so that schools have been able to sign in to the site. And we've had like a live web chat with atomic bomb survivors, and then those are logged on the site. So that's one interactive technique that's been used. The other thing that we have up on the site is something called the BB demonstration, and some listeners might be familiar with this, but this is using sound to understand the firepower of the world's nuclear arsenal. And in that imagination exercise, we use the sound of one BB dropping in the tin to represent the firepower of the Second World War. And by comparison, some 2,000 BBs are dropped into a tin to signify the firepower of the current nuclear arsenal. So that's another interactive technique that we're using on the site. There's also a student's toolkit for disarmament, which gives students a lot of ideas. And this is both for nuclear disarmament issues and also small arms issues, where students are given 10 different tools that they can use in their own schools and communities about how to become informed and become engaged, really for young people to become agents of social change, if you will. So there's like how to start a school club, rules for initiating a school debate, how to set up a seminar, ideas about writing letters to elected representatives, and film series, how to set that up, how to host a radio show. So it's a really hands-on toolkit that can be downloaded. Of course, the Cyber School Bus is a site of the United Nations, so this is targeted towards an international community. So we're hoping that as traffic to the site grows, that young people that use it might have a forum for engagement and interaction with each other. So there's a lot of potential to be tapped there, and we hope that people will use that and find it useful.
What's some of the feedback that you get from young people? Because I imagine you work with young people a lot. So let's say you're with students who really don't know much about the issue, and then they participate in one of these exercises like Ask a Hibakusha. What do they tell you about their experience afterwards?
Well, I feel extraordinarily privileged to work personally with atomic bomb survivors because, of course, everybody can recognize that they are becoming old and dying, and with them goes their personal stories. And I think it was the former Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed al-Baradei, who said, as we get farther from the realities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we get closer to nuclear weapons use again because people have forgotten what they mean. And so to bring living witnesses into the classroom is an extraordinary honor and privilege, and that's not lost on the students. And so for them to meet these buoyant, hopeful, courageous elders, and for them to recognize that they're receiving a story that is a story of personal pain, extraordinary pain, and loss, but also exceptional courage and compassion, that it's not only something that they're receiving from an elder, but it helps inspire them in their own lives. Working here in New York City, we do a lot of work with international schools. So some of the students that we're working with are first-time immigrants that are coming over to the United States and are rebuilding their lives. And so there's some kind of interaction that has occurred where students have come here from war-torn countries, and they really feel their experience reflected in the Hibakusha, and they also feel an enormous amount of inspiration. So I think across the board, whether it's just regular old New Yorkers like us that are listening to the stories, or people who are just coming over and rebuilding their lives from many, many different countries, to hear the stories of survival, to receive that inspiration, and to help it affect our own lives. I like to say that being around the atomic bomb survivors has me wanting to become a better person.
And it seems that many atomic bomb survivors have not only been able to relate their stories and testimonies to young people in a very effective way, but that they have also dedicated their lives to promoting peace, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And the average age now of atomic bomb survivors is well into their late 70s. So this is really the twilight years of their lives. And for them to be able to focus their attention and to work particularly, we often get the question, what does it feel like for you to come to the country which dropped the bomb? And, various people have various responses. It's not a pat or a pro forma thing. Sakue Shimohira, who is a Hibakusha from Nagasaki, said, I'm still full of anger and sadness that this happened to me, my family, and my people. But that sadness and anger propels me to share my story, and it's the war that we hate, and that we don't want other people to suffer the way that we suffered. That really is a sort of major message that we receive from the Hibakusha. But the other thing that is hugely important with their story, not only the compassion, not only the hope, but it helps young people really understand the reality of nuclear weapons. And I think today, with all of the sort of crazy synthesized violence in the entertainment industry, in the video games, and the kind of almost passé attitude towards nukes, has really dumbed us as a people into what these weapons actually mean. I mean, I don't think that we should even call them weapons. I mean, they are instruments of genocide. They're instruments of omnicide. They are inventions of human ingenuity that have created radionuclides that last and cause cancer and genetic defects for, well into 12,000 human generations. And considering that we are only 600 generations into the human experience, that is something that we should really get our mind around. How do we understand that? How do we educate around that? And how do we bring that experience into the classroom without creating a lot of fear and, just frozenness? There are ways that we can respond. And certainly the Hibakusha witness to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is probably one of the most profound ways that we can educate ourselves and others on the realities of nuclear weapons and what the human spirit can overcome and how we can work to create, not only a world without nuclear weapons, but a world without war. If we have the weapons that can destroy all life on Earth in the spate of an afternoon, I think violence writ large needs to be revisited, and that's the ultimate goal of disarmament education in my mind.
Our guest has been Dr. Kathleen Sullivan. She is are you the director of Hibakusha Stories? Is that your?
I work with my dear friend and colleague Robert Kronquist, and we're both the program directors of Hibakusha Stories. And if people would like to find out more information, you can look on the internet. It's www.hibakushastories.org.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you, John.
Our guest today has been Dr. Kathleen Sullivan, speaking about disarmament and non-proliferation education. This program has been produced by the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs with technical support by the UN Department for Public Information. Our audio engineers are Benji Candelario and Rosie Starr. The music for this program was composed by Kevin McLeod. The opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the interviewee and do not necessarily reflect the views of the United Nations. My name is John Ennis.